All right, so here we go. So let's talk about the readings and what we're here to celebrate today. Because especially in today's first reading, I'm going to introduce several pieces, but don't worry, I'm going to bring those pieces together at the end of the homily, okay? So of course, the first thing that I want to bring in, the first piece is today's readings, because especially in the first reading, what you have is Isaiah describing in a very beautiful way the light that is going to shine on the people of Israel, because remember, they're in bondage, and they're not only going to be released from that bondage and go home, but it's that very light, that very presence of God that he's talking about, okay? So whenever you hear light, that's that presence of God, okay? And he even puts it in a point of that not only darkness, but he puts it more specifically when he says a dark cloud. Because we all know that driving through a cloud, if you've ever, like Washoe Valley, holy cow, you can be driving along really well and then all of a sudden hit a patch of that fog. Well, what happens in that fog? Boy, do we reduce speed drastically, don't we? Because it's icy fog. And we don't know what's going to happen and we can't see, so we adjust. Well, that dark cloud, especially, is really scary. I remember last week when the power went out. Woo! Boy, it gets dark, but I just didn't realize just how dark it was until we didn't have power and there was no TV, no nothing. And trying to use a candle just doesn't cut it. So and then you make changes, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment. But you make changes, and then it makes a big difference when that light comes on, doesn't it? It illuminates everything. And that dark cloud brings a sense of, oh, it's a total mood killer, okay? So he brings that darkness and that dark cloud, and he brings that light, that presence of God that's going to pierce it, and not only pierce it, but light up everything. And then we have in today's second reading where Paul is talking about the Gentiles, and the reason that he's talking about them and basically saying accept them, because God has accepted them, meaning the light of God is shining on them. So in doing that, there's that acceptance, that bring them into the community, that change, if you will, okay? And that's the theme, is that this change that's happening in the first reading and the change in the second reading, okay? Now let's talk about today's gospel. Because as we just heard in today's gospel, is that there's something powerful going on here, because we all know Epiphany is about God revealing himself, and we can all spend the rest of the day sitting here and talk about and share our stories, how God has revealed himself, especially in those dark times when we needed him. Those epiphany moments where God has come in and changed those dark times and shined his presence in there, and we've known his presence in that epiphanal, did I say that right?
I have no idea.
It sounds pretty good. We'll stick with that. In that epiphanal moment, I like it.
Okay.
In that epiphanal moment, God has come into those dark times of our lives and has brought in light, and we know that he's been there. I know one of our parishioners was having a tough time a couple weeks ago, and she was driving home all the way from Bishop, and this rainbow followed her the whole time. The whole time that rainbow was always in her sight. Or one day I was having a tough time and I looked out the window and there was a rainbow. Or driving down the road and you're thinking about something and that epiphanal moment comes in. But it's not just the presence of God moving in and that light coming in and piercing the darkness. But my brothers and sisters, what it brings is a change. And what also happens is that, we're in that time, we're in that frame of mind, we're in that spiritual moment, and this light comes into the darkness and brings a change. I'll give you an example. As I mentioned before last week, boy, did I change a lot of things, okay? never had a flashlight around. I'm like, no, everything's fine. Well, you change, especially when you're in the dark for you don't know how long. You go buy a candle, not purchase, but you have a candle there. And I talked about this last week. You learn how to, where is the candle, feeling around for it, finding the matches, okay, all this feeling and touching thing, and going, well, gee, maybe a flashlight would be good. And then nothing is more wonderful than at 5:45 in the morning, there's that nightstand that's shining a light in your face. And you're going, yes, yes. Especially because I had plans for how we were going to celebrate Mass last Sunday. Say, candles at the door, take a candle with you when you go to the bathroom, bundle up to somebody relatively close to you to stay warm, and here we go celebrating Mass. And also changes as far as, gee, we do have a backup generator, but it's only for the pump, for the well pump. So, gee, maybe we need to look into getting a backup generator for the whole building. And also, as I said, getting a couple of flashlights. So now I have a flashlight in my apartment, a flashlight in my office, and a flashlight in Liz's office. And somebody brought me, they're the coolest things, I didn't know they existed, was this lantern light. You know what I'm talking about? Aren't they the most awesome things? I take that sucker with me from the house to the garage just to have a smoke at night. It is so cool. And also those flashlights where somebody brought them from Costco that they sell. I'm not advertising Costco, but just saying. And you move the end and you adjust the end of it, and it brings it to a narrow light to a really, yeah. I was like, let me tell you something. I was like a little kid after I got that lantern and that flashlight, just going outside going, oh, deep, 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 deep. But it's that change that comes with it, where before I'm like, oh, it's fine. I can adapt. But I tell you, when you're trying to sleep on New Year's Eve and you wake up at every little sound outside your window, and you're the only one here on a mountaintop, gets a little scary. Gets a lot scary. Where before we have the security lights out front. So you change. Well, what's also interesting in today's gospel is this, and this is the other point that I want to bring into this, is that notice in today's gospel is that when the wise men show up, they knock at the door. Doesn't that signify like a house? They knock on the door, and theologians have talked about this. And also, they don't say infant, they say child. So it's the child knocking at the door. And again, theologians have talked about this. They've argued about this. And what it brought up in my prayer life was that how many times does Jesus himself say, I knock at the door? I stand there knocking. So Jesus is always standing there knocking at the door of our hearts, having that light that is him, asking us to change, asking us to trust him, asking us to deepen our faith with him. And we know he's at the door because that grace of God, that presence of Christ that is within us, especially by our baptism, tells us that we know that Jesus is at the door knocking. But what happens is that call to change stops us maybe in the living room from answering the door. There's a beautiful picture that I've seen where Jesus is at the door knocking, but there's no door handle on his side. The door handle is on our side. And maybe we want to open the door, we want to embrace that change, we want to have that light coming in, but that fear stops us in our tracks, and it's okay in the living room to say, I know you're there, but I'm afraid. I know you're there, but I'm having a hard time moving out of my tracks. I know you're there, and I really want to open the door to you, but again, I'm afraid. Maybe that fear, to be honest, is our complete trust in Him. Because change is a very, very scary thing. And sometimes we get stuck where we are, and it's like, nope, I'm good. I'm good. And I'll speak for me only. I'm too old. I'm 55, done a lot. I'm good. I'm happy. I'm content. And what the Lord calls us to do is that in that trust and that faith in Him, is that He's saying, I know you're content, but I can give you life and give it to you more fully. I can give you a peace that only I can give. And what does it say in the Old Testament? God is speaking, and I'm paraphrasing, I have plans for you that you can't even possibly imagine. But it takes that trust, that moving out of our comfort zone, that moving out of our fear, and opening up the door so the light comes in, changes us, and it's that adapting to that new situation that we're in. Because we're in that new situation always through, with, and in Christ. And we discover things in that change that we couldn't possibly even imagine. And enjoying it, even if it's a little thing like what I said before, enjoying like, oh my gosh, I didn't know they made that lantern light. And going outside and playing with that flashlight. See? So that fear is replaced by joy, by wonder, by a newness. And it's also, and the way that we cross that living room is by prayer. The way that we cross the living room is in this wonderful community that we're in, helping one another, even if it's something as helping one another to the car, whatever it may be, and stepping across the room, bending over, and finding that light to turn it on. All of that is there. And it does. It takes prayer, it takes community, and it takes the Eucharist. The Eucharist that is the light. The Eucharist that is the very presence, the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ. The Eucharist that gives us the courage, the strength, and the fortitude to walk across the living room, open up the door, embrace the Lord, and welcome Him in more fully into our lives. So as we continue with our Eucharistic celebration and go through this beautiful day that the Lord has given us, let's celebrate the change that God calls us to. Let's celebrate the presence of Christ is always in our hearts. Let's celebrate the presence of Christ that calls us to change, calls us to grow, overcome our fear, and open the door more fully to Him. Amen? Amen. Let us stand now.